The doctors gave him 6 months. He spent them building a mountain paradise that's still warming him and his grandchildren. Adirondack Mountains, New York, October 1887. The doctor folded his spectacles with deliberate slowness that told Thomas Brennan everything before the words came. 6 months, perhaps 8 if he was fortunate. The consumption had taken root too deeply in his lungs. There were sanitariums, the doctor said, places where Thomas could rest in clean air, but they both knew what that meant. Thomas had seen the sanitarium in Albany, rows of beds filled with hollow-eyed men and women waiting. The smell of carbolic acid and decay. He had visited his own uncle there 3 years prior, watched the man waste away over 6 weeks. He would not do that to Daniel. He would not have his son's last memories be of a father drowning in his own lungs in a room that smelled of death and lye soap.
Thomas walked out of that office into the sharp October air and made a decision that surprised even himself. If he had only months, he would spend them building something that would outlast him. Not a gravestone or legacy of words, but a shelter so perfectly suited to this mountain it would stand for generations. A place where his son Daniel, just 12 years old, could survive the coming winter and all the winters after. Thomas's wife, Margaret, had died bringing Daniel into the world, and the boy was all he had. The thought of leaving Daniel orphaned, dependent on the charity of distant relatives who had never approved of Thomas's choice to live in these mountains, it was unbearable. Margaret's family had wanted her to marry a merchant in Albany, someone respectable. Instead, she had chosen Thomas, a woodsman who loved the mountains more than civilization. They had never forgiven him, and they would not welcome Daniel with anything but resentment and obligation. But the thought of leaving Daniel with something solid, something that would shelter and protect him, something that embodied everything Thomas knew about survival and the land, that was a legacy worth the time he had left. The mountain he chose was one he had known since childhood, a granite formation that rose above the valley floor like a great ship's prow. On its southern face, 40 feet above the forest floor, a natural alcove curved into the rock. Water had carved it over millennia, creating an overhang 20 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Thomas had sheltered there during storms while hunting, had always felt the way it held warmth, the way the stone radiated back the heat of a small fire. He had once spent a night there during an unexpected November snowstorm and had woken warm despite the blizzard raging beyond the overhang. The rock had been warm to the touch, even in the morning, hours after the fire had died to ash. That memory had stayed with him, a seed of understanding about how stone could be more than just shelter from rain and wind. Most men built their cabins in the valleys, near water and flat land, but those cabins were exposed to every wind, vulnerable to the full force of winter. They required constant fires, enormous amounts of wood, and even then the cold seeped through every crack. But this alcove, this natural shelter carved by ancient waters into living granite, offered something different. It offered partnership with the mountain itself. He brought Daniel to see it on a clear morning when the first frost had silvered the grass. The boy stood at the base of the cliff, his neck craned back, and Thomas watched him understand. Daniel had his mother's dark eyes and quick mind, and Thomas could see him already calculating the height, the approach, the possibilities. "We're going to live there?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying excitement rather than fear. "We're going to build there," Thomas said. "Into the rock, not on top of it. The mountain will be our walls. We'll work with what's already here." They started the next day. Thomas knew his strength would fail, knew the coughing fits would worsen, knew he was racing against his own body's collapse. But he also knew stone and timber, had worked construction in Lake Placid, had learned from his father how to read the land. His father had been a stonemason in Ireland before coming to America, and Thomas had spent his childhood watching the old man work, learning to see the grain in stone, to understand how weight and pressure moved through rock. His father had built walls that still stood in County Cork, and he had taught Thomas that stone was not just material, but a language, a way of thinking about permanence and structure. That knowledge, passed down through generations, would now serve to protect his son. The first task was the approach. The cliff face was too steep for a permanent ladder, so Thomas and Daniel spent a week carving footholds into the granite using hammer and chisel. Every 2 feet, a notch deep enough for a boot, angled slightly upward to shed rain. Thomas worked until his hands bled, until the coughing doubled him over, until he tasted blood in his mouth and had to sit gasping, while Daniel watched with frightened eyes. Then Thomas would wipe his mouth, grip the hammer again, and continue. Daniel learned to swing the hammer, to read the grain of the stone, to know when to strike and when to wait. The boy's hands blistered and bled, but he never complained. He understood, though Thomas had not spoken it directly, that they were racing against death itself. Thomas would wake before dawn, his chest tight with fluid, and force himself to his feet. Some mornings the coughing was so severe he could not stand upright for an hour. He would sit, hunched by their campfire at the base of the cliff, spitting blood into the dirt, waiting for his lungs to clear enough to work. Daniel would sit beside him, silent and patient, holding a cup of water. The boy never asked if they should stop, never suggested they abandon the project. He seemed to understand that this work was keeping his father alive, that purpose was a stronger medicine than rest. By the end of October, they could climb to the alcove without rope. Thomas stood in the natural shelter and paced it out. 30 feet wide, 20 feet deep, the ceiling of natural stone arcing 12 feet overhead at its highest point. The floor was uneven granite, tilted slightly outward for drainage. The southern exposure meant the alcove would catch the low winter sun. The overhang was deep enough to protect against rain and snow driven by the prevailing northwest winds. The stone itself was solid granite, not the fractured, unstable rock that could collapse without warning. Thomas ran his hands over the walls, feeling for cracks, for signs of weakness. This alcove had stood for thousands of years and would stand for thousands more. He found ancient marks on the stone, scratches that might have been made by animals or perhaps by native peoples who had sheltered here long before. The thought pleased him. This place had protected others, and it would protect his son. "The stone will be 3 of our walls," Thomas explained, his voice rough from the morning's coughing fit. "We build only what we must. We extend what the mountain already offers." They began gathering materials. Daniel learned to select timber, to choose the straight young pines that would serve as beams, to reject the trees with hidden rot or too many knots. They felled trees at the forest edge, stripped the bark using draw knives, working the blades along the length of each log to expose the smooth wood beneath. The bark would rot and harbor insects, but the bare wood would last for decades if kept dry. They dragged the logs to the cliff base using rope and determination, Thomas pulling until his lungs burned and his vision darkened, Daniel adding his smaller strength without complaint. Thomas showed his son how to rig a pulley system using rope and a beam anchored at the alcove's edge, a simple mechanical advantage that allowed them to lift weights that would otherwise be impossible. Together they hauled each log up the 40-foot face, Daniel climbing with the rope, Thomas guiding from below until the coughing made him stop. Then Daniel guiding from above while Thomas rested. Each log was a victory. Each day that Thomas woke able to work was a gift. The front wall rose slowly. Thomas set corner posts deep into cracks in the stone floor, wedged them with smaller rocks, secured them with iron pins he forged himself over a fire. The posts had to be absolutely solid, because everything else would depend on their stability. The wall would be double-layered, he decided, inner and outer walls of vertical logs, the gap between them packed with moss and clay and small stones. Insulation, precious as gold. He had seen too many mountain cabins where men froze despite roaring fires because the walls were single thickness, because the builders had not understood that trapping dead air was as important as blocking wind. Cold was not a thing in itself, but the absence of heat, and heat moved through solid materials far more easily than through air. A double wall with a dead air space between would slow that heat loss dramatically.
Thomas explained this to Daniel as they worked, making sure the boy understood the principle so he could apply it elsewhere, so he could repair and improve the wall in years to come. He drew diagrams in the dirt, showing how heat moved, how air trapped between barriers became an invisible shield. Daniel absorbed it all, asking questions that showed he was thinking beyond the immediate task to future problems and solutions. November brought the first real snow, fat flakes that fell silently through the forest and began to accumulate. Thomas woke one morning to find Daniel already up, trying to light a fire with shaking hands. The boy's lips were blue, his breath coming in visible puffs in the frigid air. They had been sleeping in the alcove for a week, but without the front wall complete and without a proper heating system, the space was barely warmer than outside. Thomas realized with cutting clarity that they could not wait to finish properly. They needed heat now. That day, Thomas built the firebox. He cleared a section of the alcove floor down to bare stone, then constructed a U-shaped wall of flat rocks mortared with clay. The opening faced into their shelter, but the back of the firebox extended to the outside edge of the alcove, where he built a chimney of stacked stone that would draw the smoke out and away. The key was the stone itself. The granite would absorb the heat from the fire and radiate it for hours after the flames died. Thomas selected each stone carefully, choosing flat pieces that would stack tightly, that would present maximum surface area to the fire. He built the firebox walls 2 feet thick, massive enough to store significant heat. The thermal mass was critical. A thin firebox would heat quickly but cool quickly, while a thick one would take longer to warm but would hold that warmth far longer. He angled the interior surfaces to reflect heat inward, creating a parabolic shape that would focus warmth into their living space. He built a second element that evening, working by firelight while Daniel slept wrapped in both their blankets. Behind the firebox, deeper in the alcove, Thomas constructed a sleeping platform of flat stones elevated 2 feet off the ground. The platform sat directly behind where the fire would burn, separated by the thickness of the firebox wall. The heat would warm the stone platform, and they would sleep on top of it, insulated from the cold ground, warmed by the thermal mass below them. It was a design he had seen once in a book about Roman hypocausts, ancient heating systems that moved warm air beneath floors. Thomas worked through his exhaustion, through coughing fits that left him gasping and dizzy, through moments when his vision blurred and his hands shook so badly he could barely grip the stones. That night, they lit the first fire. Thomas fed it slowly, letting the stones heat gradually so they would not crack from thermal shock. Stone could be treacherous. Heat it too quickly and it would fracture, rendering hours of work useless. After 2 hours, he banked the coals and led Daniel to the sleeping platform. He had laid pine boughs over the warm stone, then their blankets. Daniel curled up on it, and within minutes was asleep, his breathing deep and regular, his body finally relaxed after days of shivering.
Thomas lay beside his son and felt the warmth rising through the stone, steady and deep, more reliable than any fire. His chest ached with more than sickness. This was working. The design was sound. Daniel would survive. The front wall took 3 more weeks. Thomas worked in short bursts now, his strength failing faster than he had anticipated. The consumption was progressing, eating away at his lungs, making every breath an effort. Some days he could only work for an hour before exhaustion forced him to rest. But Daniel was learning, growing stronger and more capable with each passing day. The boy could split logs now, could mix clay and moss into chinking, could work the pulley system alone. His hands had developed calluses, his shoulders had broadened from the constant labor, and his movements had become efficient and confident. Thomas focused on teaching, on making sure Daniel understood not just what to do, but why. The wall leans inward slightly, Thomas explained one afternoon, his hand on a vertical post. See? 5 degrees. When snow piles against it, the weight pushes down and in, but the stone of the alcove behind us resists. The wall becomes stronger under load, not weaker. Daniel nodded, his eyes tracing the angle of the wall, understanding the geometry of it. They left gaps for a door and 2 small windows, which Thomas framed with squared timbers. For the door, he built a thick panel of horizontal planks backed with crossbeams, hung on iron hinges he traded for in Keene Valley, his last trip down the mountain. The journey had nearly killed him. The 6-mile walk down and back up had left him coughing blood for 2 days, but the hinges were essential. A door that sagged or failed would make the entire shelter useless. The windows he covered with oiled canvas that let in light but held back wind. Glass would have been better, but glass was expensive and fragile, and if it broke, Daniel might not be able to replace it. Canvas could be patched or replaced with materials from the forest. December arrived with bitter cold, temperatures plunging below 0 at night. The wall was complete, and Thomas turned his attention to the roof. The alcove's overhang provided natural protection, but he wanted more. He built a frame of lighter pawls that extended from the top of their front wall back to the stone ceiling, creating a sloped roof within the larger shelter of the rock. This inner roof would trap a layer of air between itself and the stone ceiling above, providing additional insulation. Over this frame, he and Daniel laid sheets of birch bark, overlapped like shingles, then a layer of sod cut from the forest floor, then stones to hold everything down. The result was a living roof that would grow grass in spring, that would blend into the mountain as if it had always been there. The space was perhaps 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep, not large by any measure, but it felt substantial. The stone walls radiated a sense of permanence, of security. The warmth from the firebox spread evenly through the space, and the sleeping platform was comfortable in a way that surprised even Thomas. He had built better than he knew. Thomas built a second thermal feature in mid-December along the back wall, where bare granite formed their rear boundary. He constructed a series of stone shelves and alcoves. During the day, when the sun struck the southern face of the mountain, the rock absorbed warmth. Inside, that warmth radiated from the back wall into their space. Thomas positioned their sleeping platform to capture both the heat from the firebox and the residual warmth from the sun-heated stone behind them. He explained to Daniel how the stone was like a bank, storing deposits of heat during the day and paying them back slowly through the night. Daniel suggested placing flat stones near the firebox during the day, then moving them to the sleeping platform at night, creating portable heat sources. Thomas smiled at the innovation, pleased that his son was beginning to think like a builder, to see possibilities and improvements. "The mountain is a battery," Thomas told Daniel one evening, his voice barely a whisper now. "It stores heat. We just have to know how to draw it out." On Christmas Eve, Thomas was too weak to leave the sleeping platform. The consumption had reached a critical stage, his lungs so damaged that even shallow breathing was difficult. Daniel maintained the fire, kept it burning steady, fed it through the night. The boy had become competent in ways that broke Thomas's heart and filled him with pride in equal measure. Daniel could read the weather by the color of the sky, could judge how much wood they needed by the temperature and wind, could bank coals to last until morning. He moved through their small space with quiet efficiency, anticipating needs before they arose. Thomas had expected to die by Christmas. The doctors' 6 months had been optimistic. But something strange was happening. The constant warmth, the dry air of the alcove, the absence of drafts and dampness. His coughing had not worsened. He was not recovering. The damage to his lungs was permanent, but he was not declining as rapidly as before. The consumption was still there, still eating at his lungs, but the conditions that usually accelerated it were absent. He was warm, dry, and at rest. His body, given a reprieve from fighting cold and damp, was holding on with stubborn determination. January brought the deepest cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero in the valley, colder on the mountain. Thomas could hear the wind howling outside, could hear trees cracking in the forest as sap froze and expanded, the sound like distant rifle shots. But inside their stone shelter, with a fire burning and the thermal mass of the rock working its slow magic, the temperature never fell below 40 degrees. Thomas and Daniel wore wool shirts, not the heavy coats required outside. They could work with bare hands. They could sleep without shivering. Thomas began to understand that he had built something more sophisticated than he had initially realized. The combination of the natural alcove, the insulated front wall, the thermal mass of the firebox and sleeping platform, and the heat stored in the back wall created a system that maintained stable temperatures with remarkably little fuel. They burned perhaps a third of the wood that a conventional cabin would require. This efficiency meant Daniel could maintain the shelter alone, could gather enough wood without exhausting himself, could survive winters even after Thomas was gone. Thomas used his remaining strength to teach Daniel everything: how to read the forest for game trails, how to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, how to identify which plants would return in spring, where to find cattail roots and wild onions, which mushrooms were safe and which would kill, how to maintain the firebox, replacing cracked stones before they failed, how to repair chinking in the walls, how to keep water from freezing in their clay jugs by storing them near the warm back wall. He taught Daniel to keep a calendar, scratching marks on a smooth section of stone, to track the phases of the moon and the movement of constellations. He taught him that survival was not about dramatic gestures, but about small, consistent actions repeated daily. It was about maintaining the fire, checking the snares, keeping tools sharp, staying dry. It was about routine and discipline, and paying attention to details. February proved Thomas's design. A blizzard struck that lasted 3 days, piling snow 6 feet deep in the forest below. Wind screamed across the mountain face with a sound like tortured souls, but the alcove's orientation and depth protected them. Their front wall, leaning into the mountain, held firm against the pressure. The roof, pressed down by accumulated snow, became even better insulated. They stayed inside, warm and dry, working their way through their stores of dried venison and cornmeal. Thomas told Daniel stories about his mother, about Margaret's laugh and her fierce intelligence, about how she had loved these mountains as much as Thomas did. He described how she had insisted on climbing to the summit of Mount Marcy on their honeymoon, how she had stood at the top with wind whipping her hair and declared it the most beautiful place on earth. He told Daniel that she would have been proud of what they had built, proud of the man Daniel was becoming. He told him about Ireland, about his own father and the stone walls that crisscrossed that green island, walls that had stood for centuries. He told him that building was an act of faith, a belief that the future mattered, that what you made with your hands could outlive you and serve people you would never meet. March brought the first thaw, and with it, the realization that Thomas had survived the winter. 6 months had passed since the doctor's pronouncement, then 7, then 8. Thomas was not healed. He could feel the consumption still in his lungs, could taste blood some mornings. But he was alive. The warmth, the dry air, the absence of stress and dampness had given him time. He began to hope, cautiously, that he might see another summer. He used that time to refine their shelter. He built a stone oven beside the firebox, a small dome of rocks that could bake bread or roast meat, using the same heat that warmed their space. He constructed storage alcoves in the natural crevices of the back wall, places where food would stay cool but not freeze, where the stable temperature of the deep stone would preserve their supplies. He showed Daniel how to collect clay from a stream bed and use it to make vessels, how to shape them and fire them in the coals. He taught him to make rope from plant fibers, to tan hides using brains and smoke, to make tools from bone and antler. Every skill was another piece of independence, another way Daniel could survive without having to depend on the world below. In April, Thomas climbed down to the forest floor for the first time in months. His legs shook, but he made it. He walked through the awakening woods with Daniel, showing him the spring greens, the return of birds, the places where fish would spawn in the streams. They gathered seeds and planted a small garden on a flat area near the cliff base, where Daniel could tend it easily. Thomas knew he might not live to see the harvest, but Daniel would. A garden was more than food. It was a commitment to the future, a declaration that life would continue. Thomas lived through that spring and into summer. He was gaunt, his cough persistent, but he was present. He watched Daniel grow taller, watched him become capable and confident. They improved the shelter, adding a rainwater collection system that channeled water from the roof into clay vessels, a smoking rack for meat positioned where the smoke from their fire would naturally drift, a better ladder to replace the carved footholds. Thomas built a small forge area where he could work metal, repairing tools and making simple implements. He showed Daniel how to work iron, how to heat and hammer and temper, skills that would make him valuable, that would give him trade goods and the ability to maintain their equipment. In August, Thomas taught Daniel to hunt with the rifle, to track deer through the forest, to read sign and predict movement, to wait with patience for the right shot. They brought down a buck together, and Daniel dressed it himself, following his father's instructions, his hands steady and sure. They smoked the meat and stored it in the cool alcoves, preparing for another winter. Thomas knew, watching his son work with confidence and skill, that Daniel would be all right. The boy was 14 now, nearly a man, and he had learned everything Thomas could teach him. September arrived, and Thomas knew his borrowed time was ending. The coughing was worse again, the blood more frequent, his strength fading day by day. His body had fought as long as it could, but the consumption was winning. But he had done what he set out to do. The shelter was complete, perfected through a full cycle of seasons. Daniel knew how to survive. More than that, he knew how to thrive, how to live in harmony with this mountain, how to take what it offered and give back respect and care. On a clear morning in late September, Thomas sat at the entrance to their dwelling, looking out over the valley. The leaves were beginning to turn, gold and red spreading through the forest below. The air was crisp and clean, and the light had that particular quality of early autumn, sharp and clear. Daniel sat beside him, and Thomas put his arm around his son's shoulders. "This place will take care of you," Thomas said. "The stone holds warmth. The alcove sheds wind. The forest provides. You know all of this now." "I know," Daniel said, his voice steady. There were tears in his eyes, but he didn't look away. "When you have children, you'll teach them. When they have children, they'll teach theirs. The mountain will be here. This shelter will be here. What we built together will outlast both of us." Thomas died 3 days later, quietly in his sleep on the warm stone platform he had built. Daniel buried him in the forest below, in a spot where the morning sun broke through the trees, where wildflowers grew in spring. He marked the grave with a cairn of stones, each one carefully selected and placed, the way his father had taught him. Daniel lived in the mountain shelter through that winter and the next. At 14, he was as capable as any man. He maintained the fire, checked his snares, hunted when weather permitted, and kept the shelter in good repair. At 16, he guided his first hunting party, bringing wealthy men from New York City into the mountains. He had a natural talent for it, could read the forest in ways that amazed his clients, and word spread about the young guide who lived in a remarkable dwelling carved into the mountain itself. He married at 20, brought his wife Mary to the shelter, and she marveled at its warmth, its clever design. She had expected a rough camp, but found instead a sophisticated dwelling that was comfortable even in the depths of winter. They raised 4 children in that alcove dwelling. Daniel added rooms, extending the structure deeper into the natural cavities of the rock, but he never changed his father's core design. The firebox still warmed the sleeping platforms. The stone still stored heat. The mountain still protected them. He taught his children everything Thomas had taught him, and they grew up strong and capable, at home in the wilderness. When Daniel was an old man, his grandchildren would climb up to the shelter and beg for stories. He would sit by the fire his father had designed, feeling the warmth radiate from stone that had been warming their family for decades, and he would tell them about Thomas Brennan, about a man given 6 months who spent them building something that would last forever, about how the mountain had given his father extra time, as if in recognition of what he was creating, about how love could be expressed not just in words, but in the careful placement of stones, in the angle of a wall, in the design of a firebox that would keep your children warm long after you were gone. The children would listen with wide eyes, touching the stones their great-grandfather had placed, feeling the warmth that still radiated from his work. The shelter stood for generations. Daniel's children raised their own families there. The firebox was rebuilt twice, but always in the same design. The sleeping platforms were resurfaced, but always positioned to capture the thermal mass of the stone. The front wall was repaired and reinforced, but always leaning into the mountain, always working with the land rather than against it. Each generation added something: a better door, additional rooms, improvements to the water collection system. But the core remained unchanged, a testament to Thomas's understanding of stone and heat and shelter. In the winter, when snow piled deep and wind howled through the valleys, the descendants of Thomas Brennan would gather in that alcove dwelling. They would feel the warmth rising from the stone, the heat stored in the mountain itself, and they would remember the man who had understood that survival was not about fighting nature, but about listening to it, learning from it, and building with it rather than against it. They would remember that he had been given a death sentence, and had responded by creating life, by building a home that would shelter his family for 100 years. Thomas had been given 6 months. He had used them to create something that would warm his family for generations. The mountain had kept its part of the bargain, holding that warmth in its ancient stone, radiating it back through the long winters, a gift that renewed itself season after season, generation after generation. The paradise he built was not one of comfort or luxury, but of perfect adaptation, of human ingenuity working in harmony with the eternal patience of stone and earth. It was a place where a dying man's love for his son had been transformed into walls and warmth, where every carefully placed stone was a promise kept, where the mountain itself had become family, sheltering and protecting those who understood how to listen to its ancient wisdom.